Hello everybody, and welcome to the third of our Ask Julia events for Good Grief with Julia Samuel. I'm Liesl Dawson from the University of Bristol, and today we're talking about grief after the death of a life partner. Julia Samuel, as I'm sure many of you know, is one of the UK's leading psychotherapists, as well as the founding patron of Child Bereavement UK. She's also the best-selling author of GriefWorks and This Too Shall Pass. So before we get started, I just want to remind you of some of the practicalities of the session and the structure. So like the other sessions, we'll divide this session into two halves. The first, Julie and I will speak a little bit for about a half an hour about some general points and topics, and then you'll have 30 minutes to ask questions. And we've had some questions come in, but you can also type your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. And as with last time, please feel free to type responses to one another, use the chat box to say hello, where you're from. And also, I think last time you often pointed each other to resources and gave kind of helpful advice. So do feel free to do that as well. And this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on the Grief channel after. So welcome again, Julia. Lovely to have you here this evening.
Hi, Liesl, and thank you for inviting me, and to everybody that has signed on from all over the world, it looks like. And I always kind of feel these events feel so personal, and people who are signing on have got their own personal reasons, and I wish I could see all of your faces and know your stories. And in response to Liesl's questions, I'm going to be talking from my perspective. It doesn't mean that I'm right. I'm just going to talk from what experience has told me, or what I believe. And sometimes if you think something very differently, that can be clarifying. So, just don't take what I say as that you're wrong and I'm right, because it might just be clarifying for you to know that you feel differently.
That's a nice point. So to start us off, can I ask you to say a little bit, Julia, about what are some of the unique emotional challenges we face after the death of a life partner?
I mean, there are so many. I think one of the thing that everyone is aware of is it's the death of your present as you're living your life. So the person that you may have breakfast with, or you go out for in the evening, or you spend your time with, who you share your life with, it's the death of that. But it's also the death of this unique person who you have your imagined future with, where you maybe planned what you were going to do in a few years' time or in 10 years' time. And it's the death of the person who you hold all the memories of your partnership with, of maybe having children together, of holidays together. And for many people, and most people maybe, it is the most intimate relationship in your life, where whether you cohabit, whether you're married, whatever the relationship is, it's the primary, probably the primary relationship in your life, where you are your most self, and when it works, where you feel most known for all of yourself, for your good bits, bad bits, every bits. And often when we go out in the world, we put on a kind of front for the rest, for everybody else. And so for your partner, they may know more sides of you than anybody else. So it's the death of so much. And of course, I mean, I didn't even say it, and maybe this is the first thing, is, we're wired to love and be loved. So of course we love our children, if you've had children, and your other members of your family, but this is the sort of center of the person that you love, that you've chosen to share your life with and to receive love from them, however complicated the relationship is. And that's a devastating loss. And one of the things I sort of talk about in my books and when I'm with clients is the level of the loss is equal to the level of the emotional investment in the person that's died. And in some ways, you can say that's lots of people, but I would say that your partner is your primary person who you invest most love in.
Yeah, and they're sort of embedded in the fabric of your life, in every single habit and space. So you feel it everywhere. Can you say a little bit about some of the secondary losses that are common to experience after the death of a partner?
I mean, the thing is, when you said they're embedded in your life, I think one of the things that dies when your partner dies is your sense of identity as a partner, whether it's a wife or a husband or a partner or whatever it is. And you feel like there's a part of you that's missing. And I think when you go out in the world, you feel, I mean, often I've had clients that have said to me, you know, when I go out, I feel like they don't really want to be seeing me. They want to be seeing my partner that died. And I feel like I'm the least interesting half of the partnership. So you can lose confidence in yourself socially of who you are, because you're used to going into a room together, kind of having a deal, and you can catch each other's eye across the room. I mean, not that any of us have been doing that in the last year, but in pre-COVID life. And I think the one of the biggest consequences for women, because this is the way the world is rather than how it should be, women tend to lose financially more than men do. So they can be thrown into all sorts of financial problems of not being able to pay the rent, or having to sell their house, or having to move. And so there's consequential masses of losses that can happen from that.
So sort of social, economic, I suppose that one that's left out that's obvious is also sexual. So the kind of challenge to your sexual identity and your day-to-day experience of intimacy. Can you reflect a little bit about that loss?
I mean, sex is, we're wired to want to have intimacy and closeness. And of course, everybody has different levels of desire and libido. But, having one of the things people that have talked to me about it is they miss the hug before they go to sleep. It's not the kind of fancy flying from the ceiling sex, not that anyone really does that, but you know what I mean? The kind of imagined version of it. It's much more the companionship and warmth and holding hands and seeing other people holding hands. One of the things I hear often in my practice is, I saw an old couple walking down the street holding hands, and I thought we were going to be that couple. And it was just like a stab in my chest that isn't who I'm going to be. But also, sex is a life force. You feel, it's wired to procreate, and we feel very alive. Not always, but that is the kind of often the feeling of it. We feel very sort of tensely alive, and we have the intimacy and the erotic, imaginative life through sex. So when that dies, that can be devastating. And also, there's quite a lot of stigma around having sex after your partner has died, and people decide for you when you should be having sex with someone else, or when you should be having a new partner. And it may be that you just need the physical connection.
Yeah. And I suppose one of the things that we take for granted is the way that you can be physically intimate with your partner in a way that is very unconscious. You're not having to think about it. You're not asking for a hug. It might be sitting on the sofa together, or, it's just that sort of daily form of intimacy that sort of suddenly isn't there anymore.
I mean, I remember one man saying to me, it's having someone to do nothing with.
Yes. I think I've read that. It's like you can find someone to do something with, but it's difficult to find someone to do nothing with. And that comfort, that level of comfort and intimacy built up over years is very difficult to replace in any way.
And the level of trust, and often, in high days and holidays, and people look forward to Fridays, people who are now living alone, or because their partner has died, they dread the weekends. They dread the aloneness, like going out to the park and seeing families, going out to Sainsbury's and seeing a couple shopping. I mean, everything reminds them of what they had and what they no longer have. And so it's so many places that used to be places of pleasure can feel like a danger zone. They can feel like kind of a smoke alarm going off in your head because it's so intensely painful. But also I think, and I'd like people to argue with me, so I don't know if it's true, but in my experience, women and men are responded to differently when they're bereaved. And often I've heard women say that they're treated as more second-class citizens when they no longer have a man around. Like, so if they go and stay with a friend, they're put in the child's room with a Batman wallpaper, whereas a man might be put in, I don't know, the spare bedroom or something. And that's a bit simplistic as an example, but I think a lot of women feel diminished by not having a man around. And, you know, we're tribal beings, and evolutionarily we're used to being in a tribe and having a protector. And I think often, I think men feel very scared and nervous of going out, and I'm not saying they feel it worse or better, but I think women feel more exposed often without their male partner.
Although you wonder if men have fewer social structures to turn to. That
They
often,
do.
you know, I mean, stereotypically, but that women are the kind of social networkers, and that they provide the social framework for their partner. And certainly I've read that some men feel that they lose that structure somehow when they lose their partner.
Women very much, I mean, I think it's changing. I think it's a very generational thing. And younger men, I think, are more open to saying they need help and making kind of intimate, close friendships with other men or women. But certainly if you look at the research for the people who are in their 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s now, the women very much in charge of the social structures, and men are not good at recreating them for themselves. So one of the sort of things that people say, again, which is not always true by any means, that men replace and women mourn. So the research shows that men tend to have a new partner within a year of the death of their partner, and that women may remain single. I mean, of the 10 million people living alone, 8 million in the UK are women. They live longer, I mean, is also true. Women can take a long time to find another partner. But men who don't find I mean, maybe they're just sensible, because men who don't find another partner do much worse. So they tend to get depressed. After 3 years, they get often sort of illnesses from not going out, and secondary illnesses, and they die younger. So it certainly doesn't serve them well not to have a partner. It serves them better. I think the other thing that we need to include there, and maybe that won't be true of the people listening here, is that for some people, if they've been a carer for a long time, there is a sense of relief when your partner has died. If you've been married to someone who has dementia or some life-limiting disease that you've been their carer for years, you may feel guilty being relieved, but also it releases you from being at home and looking after your partner for a long time, or even just a year. You then do find a new freedom. And I've definitely worked with widows and widowers who find a new identity in themselves. You know, they lived a particular life for maybe decades, but their partner didn't like painting or didn't like traveling or didn't like whatever it was. And so they find a different version of themselves going forward. But I think that's particularly true when it's not a death out of time. So when it's a partnership, when someone's had a good span, well, not, I don't know if the word is a good span of life, but a long life. It isn't like a life interrupted.
Yeah, not a sudden death. It's much more shocking. For some people, the death of a life partner also means becoming a single parent and suddenly, you know, having kids on your own. Can you reflect a little bit about the kind of emotional and practical challenges of this?
I actually think it's one of the hardest things of your partner dying is being a single parent, because, I mean, everything is doubled. So you are emotionally distraught. You are grieving the death of your partner. You probably aren't sleeping very well. You may have masses of worries about what life going forward. You have to earn the income for two when there's one, and you're taking care of the children. And as we've kind of talked about before, you are the outcome of your children is predicted by how you grieve and how you parent. So there's an enormous psychological pressure for you to kind of not do it right, but to be okay. And you may not be okay at all. I mean, particularly if it's a suicide or a terrible traumatic death. But even if it's but when it's someone who's maybe been ill for 6 months and then died, and you've got children together, it is, I think the thing that I pick up most from those families that I see is the relentlessness of it, the exhaustion, the relentlessness, the worry, the fear, and like not being enough. Like you already feel like you're under the cosh emotionally, that you have very little. And then, something goes wrong. Like I had a client the other day whose car got nicked. And it was like, that is just the thing that was too much. It's like the world is against me. My partner has died. My children are homeschooling. I'm trying to keep a job. And then my bloody car got nicked. It's those things which are annoying for all of us. But I think if you're a single parent, feel utterly devastating.
It's a sort of pile up, I think, because you have the emotional difficulty and then you have the practical difficulty. And, couples naturally divide themselves in terms of what they do in a household. And suddenly it's like you have to take roles that aren't your normal, natural roles and get used to those whilst grieving.
And your children are grieving.
And whilst supporting your children whilst grieving. And I mean, are there any sort of tips you would give about that? I know you've said things like, trying to keep structures is always very good. What are some of your sort of top tips?
I think is make sure that you have a network of people that you can call on. And, I think we're all very reluctant to do that. But so I worked with a woman and she kind of, whose husband died very suddenly. And she got 6 people and 3 of them were men. She had 2 sons and she kind of put in the diary that they played football, they went to matches, they went to movies, they took them out for a hamburger, so that she introduced male, because they really missed the physical presence of their dad. And of course they missed him, but also a male presence. And so I think you really need your network as much as you can and make it very concrete, like things that they can do, things that can support you. And as a family, I think you have to sit around the kitchen table and talk to each other about what's difficult. And that when you've lost it because, they've finished the milk and it's 8 o'clock and you lose your rag, you just have to kind of later say, I'm really sorry, I lost my rag. I think you name what's going on. What frightens children is the unknown. So if you're unpredictable, they're looking at you frightened, like, are you going to lose it? Or are you going to be the reliable, nice parent? And so I think if you can say to them, I am going to lose it now and again. And I never want to be this person, but this is who I find myself to be because I'm missing mommy or daddy so much. So kind of name what's going on. We've talked about this before. Children need the same truth as all the adults around them. Yeah. And check what their understanding of the truth is. And children need to be able to grieve, to jump in and out of puddles, to be really sad and to be absolutely fine, happy children. And what they need most is when their comfort is not to be told, don't cry, but to be sad with you, sit on your lap, have cozy times, watching movies with hot chocolate, with, do things that soothe you and calm you.
I love what you say about giving things names and articulating what you feel, because, it's not that, of course, everyone's going to be upset. But if you can say what you're feeling, then that can be a shared intimacy and bring a kind of closeness. And it's also sort of teaching your children not how to have perfect, happy lives, but when we hit a storm, this is how we weather it together. And this is how we share our experiences. So I think, again, not trying to stay calm, but kind of including them in what's happening to you.
And the big thing is that when you've had a rupture, when you've been a storm, is the repair. It's never the fight. It's the acknowledgement. I'm sorry I lost it. I behaved badly. I feel bad. I'm really sorry. Tell me what you're feeling. what are you angry with me about? Let them name what they're upset about. Try and do a deal. Like, I'm going to try not to do this. What's the worst thing I did? Let them tell you what's the worst thing I did. Okay, I'm going to take the feedback. I'm going to work hard in not doing that. So don't fix it too soon. You have to let them be cross with you. You have to let them say what they're cross about, because when they've articulated, it makes sense for them. And then you can have the hug. But I think people often want to go in and tell them not to be cross too soon because it's unbearable. But children need to be allowed to be cross with their mum and dad if their mum and dad or dad has behaved in a way that is hurtful.
Yeah, no, I think that's really powerful advice. This is a slightly odd one, but I've seen it come up a few places. What do you do if you discover hidden aspects of your partner's life after their death? And this actually does come up a lot. You know, it doesn't need to be an affair. It can be
it can be,
but it can also just be a whole bit of their personality that somehow you didn't know about. And you suddenly have all these questions and no way of answering them. So what does one do about this kind of situation?
I think it's I think it's profoundly confusing, because you kind of feel that you knew this person and this version of them, and then you find that they were a secret, I don't know, stamp collector, or they had an affair. I mean, one is a lot more troubling than the other. But I would talk to other people that knew them. So I would acknowledge that it's another level of loss, that you kind of don't know what to trust and it's confusing. But every piece of the jigsaw that's missing is the piece that drives you nuts and obsesses you. So I would work hard to get as many pieces of that jigsaw from other people, maybe his best friend, maybe his siblings, maybe his parents or hers, to try and get as much data as possible. But then when I'm with clients, there has to be a point that you stop, because otherwise it overtakes you. So you have to set yourself, I'm going to give myself 6 months or 3 months or a year, whatever it is, to find out as much as I can. And then that is a place that I intentionally draw a line, that's all I can find out. And I have to accommodate that level of the loss, and I have to accommodate the fact that I don't know, and I grieve it and I feel it, and I feel my frustration and my fury and all of the different feelings. But I have to stop obsessing, because it's a way of derailing your grieving process. You're looking for the data rather than grieving the person that's died.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I suppose you could do something like write them a letter, you know, which I know is used in a therapeutic context, where you express your grievances to them. And whether you can imagine the answer, or you don't have to answer the answer, but at least just sort of saying your piece in some form might be helpful. Could you say something about how we can support ourselves after losing a life partner? I've seen a lot of people on the chat expressing, you know, how much pain they're in, and how we make sense of our experiences and try to adapt to this new life situation we find ourselves in.
I mean, I'm so sorry how much pain everybody's in. And, you know, the level of the love, the level of the pain. So if you really love them, you're going to feel a huge amount of pain. And pain is the thing that forces you to face this new reality that you never wanted to be true. So it is forcing you to adapt and process. And of course, you don't want to be feeling it. But the things that you do to avoid it and block the pain, you know, are the things that do you harm. But also, I think you can create rituals and ways of being that give you spaces and places to grieve, and places and spaces to feel supported and have a break from the grief. And you can't switch it off like a machine. But, you know, when I'm with a client, we might sit down and look at what, you know, their diary, and create 1 or 2 or 3 rituals in the week that link them directly to the person that's died. It might be lighting a candle and reading a poem. It might be writing them a letter. It might be wearing their shirt. It might be many different things, but intentionally doing that, and maybe journaling, writing what you're feeling, and then going for a walk, so that you release some of that feeling, and then coming back and doing some kind of meditation, and then switch and go to your computer and do your job, or ring a friend, or listen to something funny, or so that you, in the grieving process, the theory I like the best is the dual process, which is Margaret Strobe and Shute, and they talk about restoration and loss orientation. So allowing yourself to be loss oriented, to feel the grief, emote and feel all those different feelings, which you feel all at once often, and have a focus for your grief and the memories. And then restoration orientation, oscillate, where you have a break from the pain, you do something that's comforting, intentionally soothing, intentionally nice, listening to music, well, that might make you cry, but whatever it is that is intentionally soothing, and you move between the two. And over the time, you adjust to this new reality that you didn't want. My thing that I've gone on about for literally over 3 decades is exercise. That, I mean, I think I've said it every Ask Julia, haven't I? But we feel grief in our bodies. It's embodied. It's physiological. People's hearts actually hurt. And actually, some people, does them harm. But moving your bodies releases the fight or flight in your system and the freeze. It lowers the cortisol and raises the serotonin and the oxytocin. And so it kind of frees you then to have some good feelings.
Yeah,
when you stay inside and drink coffee and get very kind of locked, the grief gets locked in you and it stays stuck.
Yeah. You've talked, in your books about how embodied grief is and the way it hits us, our hearts, and in a kind of cellular level.
It does.
And I mean, grief also carries with it a lot of anxiety. And again, that's a kind of restless energy. And I think exercise does kind of release it. So it's really, really helpful. There's one comment that's come up a few times that I just want to, before we move to the questions, that I just want to pick up on, which is that somebody talks about how they get praised for being brave all the time and how annoying it is, And I just wonder, because I think that's something that a lot of people who've experienced grief experience, and it's really frustrating. Do you have any good responses to the, oh, you're so brave comment that somehow
that isn't a punch?
Well, and it also, creates this expectation that it doesn't allow vulnerability in. How does one? I guess it depends on who's asking, but is there any good way of countering that with?
I mean, I write about it in my books, in that it sort of suits the people around you. People after a funeral will often say, she was amazing, or he was amazing, he was so brave, they didn't even cry. And that really is because you're so shocked and so numb that you're not crying. But when someone says to you, you're so brave, I think the best response is to acknowledge both. So, because you don't want to just punch back, I'm not brave, I'm in agony. I think it is to acknowledge, thank you for seeing that I'm brave, but also the thing that you're not seeing is that I'm devastated, or I'm incredibly sad, and it feels important for me for you to see both, that I am outside and I'm putting on a face, which I need to do, but there's a lot going on behind the face.
Yeah, that's a great response. Yeah, I think that's perfect, and kind of sort of getting people to recognize the vulnerability behind the brave face, that the brave face isn't all there is to it.
And the other thing is, but choose your people. Yeah. So if this is someone you don't really know that well, you don't really care about, just let it go, because you don't want to be vulnerable with them. But if this is someone you care about and you want to deepen your relationship and you want them to know more what's going on for you, then I would tell them about the mask.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. We are at 1:30, so I think it's time for us to move on to some of the questions that we've gotten. And I just want to say there's been some amazing advice flying back and forth from the people and different social networks and, resources.
So, it does feel such a lovely, loving community where people are really out to help each other. That's such a special thing.
It's amazing. So I'm going to start with a longish question from a woman, Rosie, who's asking about conflicting grief needs within a family. So she writes, my husband, Tony, died in the first wave of COVID. We are all still devastated and shocked, but it's clear that my eldest son and I are dealing with our grief very differently. He says he's accepted his father's death. He's devastated but can't change it. He doesn't want to mark anniversaries, and talk of Tony's death upsets him. He gets angry. He wants to dwell on the joyful memories and not think about what might have been. I, on the other hand, can't stop thinking about all the future plans that have been stolen by this cruel disease. Tony was 65, on the brink of retiring, looking forward to new adventures and projects. While the memories are very precious, for me, they get overtaken by my despair at what was to be and never will be. So the question is how to handle the different griefs and support for each other in a way that will help us all. So kind of how can I support my sons in their grief and get support from them?
I think, in a family system, whoever's in that family, most of you will grieve differently. Men, boys tend to grieve differently than women. I mean, you can get men like women and vice versa, but men tend to want to be okay and move on and move forward and not focus on the loss. Women tend to be loss oriented and kind of ruminate and, go over the pain. And that sounds exactly what's happened with her and her son. And I think it's to acknowledge both, that there isn't a right or wrong, and talk how you can help each other do the other. So that, is there things that your son can help you with so that you have hope over your despair? Is there things that you two can talk about together that might give you something to look forward to? And not trying to force your son to grieve, but is there a project you could do together, like a photograph album or putting pictures in a frame or memory box, or create something in memorial of that, in memory of his dad, that feels like would suit him? So he obviously doesn't want the anniversary acknowledged, but talk to him about, is there things that he wants to remember his dad by doing them? Is it watching football, or I don't know, so that he can connect to the experience of his
maybe
dad.
asking him, like, I would like to do some kind of celebration. What would it, what would that look like to you if you could choose? And I wonder if she needs to find somebody else to do the anniversary, event with, that actually maybe she does need support and company. Definitely. And if her son's quite resistant, maybe there's a friend that will accompany her.
Friend, or siblings, or her best friends. But I think the two of them to acknowledge together, because it sounds like she feels more lonely than she thought she would, because they're doing it differently. And I think to mitigate against this sense of loneliness and isolation, having two different ways of operating in the same house, is to just, as again, this thing of naming it and allowing it. And the more in a family you have open communication, you build more trust. So if he feels that you're resenting him and cross with him, he'll shut down. If you feel he's like, doesn't care, doesn't love his dad as much as you loved him, then you'll be cross with him. But actually, when you can both allow each other to do it in their own way and know that beneath that, the love is very much there, that's what you share. I think that can help, because what you don't want is the pre-existing fault lines and the separation between you to get worse.
Yeah, that makes sense. And grief does put families under pressure, I think. We've got two questions about how to cope after loss that are connected, I think. The first one describes how this person lost her husband very suddenly 6 months ago when they were coming to the end of a beautiful holiday to their favorite place in Turkey. I thought I was coping okay, but last week I felt really emotional and even more lost than when he first passed away. How do I cope? And the second question that I think is kind of related is from Leslie. My husband died unexpectedly in February, age 56. We were together 33 years. They have kids. He was by no means perfect, but he was my best friend and we loved each other so. After his death, I was also furloughed and then made redundant. I see friends, but go home and wake up to absence, pointlessness, and pain. I feel old and useless. Is it possible for me to feel complete or content again? So different, but both people really trying to know how to cope after a really devastating loss.
I mean, I think the first one is that often the shock of the first months kind of numbs you from the reality of the death. And it seems like 6 months on that the shock is worn off. And so you're really aware of the pain. It's not that you're not doing it right or that you're something odd is going on. I mean, I think that is normal. I think for both of them, all that they're saying, that naming and acknowledging the level of the loss is part of the grieving process. And unfortunately, there's no short circuit for it, that, you know, this was their life partners who they absolutely loved, and the future looks very, very bleak without them. And so finding ways to express their grief helps, whether it's talking to friends, whether it's journaling, whether it's painting or doing things that kind of grief needs to be expressed. You need to find a way of getting the grief out. And I think, you know, the thing that we talk about is at the moment for both of them, there's the person-shaped hole that feels like it's everything. And over time, that shape, the hole doesn't get less, the level of the loss doesn't get less. But over time, you build your life around the hole so that you have more experiences, you have new experiences without them. And they're so raw at the beginning and the first year, maybe even 2 years. But after a while, they become familiar, so that you find a new way of living a new life.
Yeah.
You accommodate the loss.
I also wonder with Leslie if, you know, she's lost her husband, but she's also lost her job.
I know that's massive.
She's having COVID. And I almost wonder if she needs to sort of separate out some of the different things that are going on.
Yeah, they've all
because it might be also, overwhelming because of the hugeness of it. And maybe try to think about addressing each one separately and seeing, you know, that she can't get her husband back, but she might be able to volunteer or do something for work. So that might sort of ease that aspect. Sticking with COVID, the
big thing for both of them is to, I know with COVID, this has made it much worse, but connection to others, connection to your community, connection with your friends, even if it's only on Zoom. That's what they really need is, you know, when love dies, it's the love of others that helps you survive. And so ask for help. You know, it's hard to do, but if people aren't offering it, make it clear what you need, try and be specific.
Yeah.
Walking with friends. Really helps.
Absolutely. And reaching out. And it's so hard to lose your daily structure. This is about the difficulty of re-entering the world after COVID. Again, we have 2 questions on this. The first one, my husband of 42 years died 9 months ago. As much as the lockdown has brought challenges and sadness, it has also enforced a time of gentle quiet and reflection. I've not been missing out on things that others are doing because no one's doing them. But how do I prepare for re-entering the world, social activities? People keep saying there's a light at the end of the tunnel and everything will be back to normal. But of course, my light isn't the same anymore, and either is my normal. And a kind of related question from Alison, who's age 39, 18 months into widowhood and single parenthood, who wants advice about the resentment she feels as others are looking forward to lockdown, and she feels like her life has been, you know, turned upside down. And so again, one more about resentment, and the other more about how to prepare for re-entering the world.
I mean, I think re-enter at your own pace, recognize, your capacity. I think it takes as much psychological energy to kind of unlock as it did to lock down. So for you, it's true, you've had, in some senses, protection through your grieving process. A lot of people, what people find difficult is having to go out into the world, having to get to the office, having to go out and be social. And in some ways, I can see it's been devastating, but also the lack of demand has protected you. But don't expect yourself just to jump back in. Like, go very, very gently. Choose your best friend to do something with. Maybe it's to go and get a coffee, or to do something that feels kind of easy, and just pace yourself, very slowly, and tell people what you need. Let yourself know what you need. So just sort of put your toe in the water and then come back. Put your toe in the water and then come back. For the woman whose husband died, who's bitter, I think it is agony seeing that people have this life that you did have and you no longer have. And that's really what you're kind of naming, is that they're just bouncing along with all that you used to have and you don't have it anymore. So to some extent, it feels to me like you're talking about grief. I can see that it's kind of gone against yourself. But I would, one of the big, and that's when it becomes bitter. And my suggestion is that to be self-compassionate to yourself. I don't, framing it bitter almost makes you sound like you're having feeling, I think often grieving, we become a version of ourselves that we never wanted. You didn't want to be the person walking down the street and see a couple in love and want to stab them both, but it does bring up those feelings in us. So it's kind of recognizing that the grieving version of us is an unknown, unwanted version of us. But that grieving version of us requires self-compassion from us. So it's like, ow, that hurts. Kind of let yourself know that it hurts and feel it. And give yourself some tenderness. I think with bitterness, the thing about it is that it's like stings you. And so I would be gentle and kind of really tender with yourself. Like, poor me, not in a self-pitying way, but like, ouch, that really hurts.
Oh, yeah. And again, going back to your statement about asking for things, that when you feel that resentment, if you can open up to people and say, I miss being able to do X, will you do this with me? Or will you help me with this? That might also sort of move the resentment towards something like
gratitude.
shared pain, and also gratitude to others for helping. We have a question about how to deal with difficult family members. My husband died suddenly and unexpectedly, leaving me with preschool children.
Whoa.
We had a good marriage and a large social network who have supported me hugely. Do you have any advice of how to deal with a difficult narcissistic mother-in-law and a brother-in-law who have made minimal contact? I feel I should keep the relationship going for the sake of the kids, even though there is no compassion or support for me and us. So how do I keep mentally well dealing with them? And I guess the larger question is, should she carry on trying to make this relationship work?
I mean, I think what's really healthy and on your side is that you recognize early on that you're not going to get your needs met by your mother-in-law and your brother-in-law, and that they have their own kind of narcissistic and difficult behaviors. So I think the less you invest in it, the less you will suffer. But I think when I would keep contact, just because it isn't, they will remind, particularly the brother in some ways, but also his mother, for your children to see versions of their dad in his family, things that look the same, remind them of them. It would be, as you say, is important for your children. So I would keep your expectations super low and make the meetings with them very straightforward, so that you go around for tea, you have tea, you leave. I don't know if they live miles away or what happens, or that you have a Zoom, but make it not that often, but keep the relationship going in as simple and as uninvested, low expectation ways you can, so that you don't get hurt and you don't get disappointed and you don't get furious.
That's good. That's good. And I think, you know, keeping your eyes on the fact that this might be healthy and helpful to the children seems like a good reason to try to keep that going.
Because they might want later, they're preschool, so they're so young, but later they may want to go to their uncle and ask about what their dad was like when he was a child, when he was a little boy. What sports did he do? What was his favorite something when he was a child? What was the funniest thing that happened to him when he was 7? You know, they might want those stories.
Yeah.
And it is a slight double death if you lose the family as well.
That makes sense. We have a question about the loss of intimacy and also the possibility of a new partner. So sort of, you know, a bit of both. I lost my partner 31 years. We were both age 51 at the time. 2 questions. Firstly, any advice on coming to terms with the loss of intimacy after being together for so long? And secondly, any advice for starting over again with a new partner? I remember reading in Julia's book that men have a tendency to try to replace while women spend longer grieving. Now, 18 months after the death of my partner, I find myself developing feelings for someone else. And although it's very early days, my 3 children are all in their early 20s. Any advice on how to approach starting over? How long is it best to leave it? And how should I introduce the new person to my children and extended family when the time comes?
That's about 17 questions, by the way.
Yeah, it is. It is a lot of questions.
So my first response is, I'm so pleased you have feelings for another person, that we are capable of having multiple loves in our lives, so that you love the partner that you had who's died, and you can potentially love a new partner. So to allow that possibility, I think, is really good. And the intimacy, grieving the intimacy is what you have been grieving, and hopefully with a new partner, you will gain intimacy. With your family, I think it's a tough boundary to hold, because you don't want to give them power to say yes or no, you can't have a new partner, but you also want to be sensitive to them. It could easily trigger them or upset them. So it's holding the line. So first of all, you have to date this person and see whether you like him. And again, I would go slowly and allow yourself to recognize the differences. So, you know, it'll bring up lots of feelings about your partner that's died, and allow yourself to kind of allow those feelings to emerge, but also to enjoy the excitement of someone being interested in you, of someone taking you for a drink, of someone taking you for a walk. All the dating I hear about in my job is that everyone, all they do is go for walks. They go for hours and hours. And so with the family, once you kind of like the guy more, so I wouldn't introduce him till you've really seen each other quite a lot, where you kind of think there's a future. Then I would tell your children that there's someone that you like, and ask him for supper or lunch or something over the weekend, and introduce him slowly, and ask them what they feel, and allow them to say what they're upset about, but also hold a boundary, like, this is your life and you need to be allowed to move forward with your life. And you know, I remember,
remind them that they're not going to replace their father. You know,
they're never going to. That's very
that loving someone new is not. It doesn't mean in any way that other person you've stopped loving them.
No.
And if you can talk about the father with the new partner and include his presence in those conversations, then I think that's also really helpful to the children to know that the dad's not being erased.
Yeah, I should have said that at first. That's absolutely the best point. Yeah.
It's not the best point. It's just a point. We have some questions that have come in from the Q&As tonight. One that is very sad, and I think this person maybe should need some therapy and some support. My husband took his life 2.5 years ago. I'm frozen in time, still in shock, and I still can't believe he is dead. I haven't even changed the bed sheets. I'm living in squalor. Nobody knows, as nobody has visited me for a year during lockdown. People told me it would get better, but it just gets worse. How will it ever get better?
I think you really do need to get active support. I think maybe you should go to your GP, because, you know, people say time is a healer, and in a way, I think grief changes over time, but when it's a sudden and traumatic death like your partner, it actually stays locked in you and you're frozen like you are. And you need proper psychotherapeutic help for trauma. The one I refer people to is EMDR. So please go and get yourself proper psychotherapeutic support. You can't do this on your own. You can't do this. You're not seeing friends, but I'm so glad you joined this evening at our community, and it feels like it's a first step to support yourself. Please take a second step and get some proper help.
Yeah, because time in and of itself
Doesn't
not
do
heal.
anything.
You need support. You need to tell your story. You need people to hear you and listen to you and be compassionate, and for you to be compassionate to yourself. So yes,
grief
please.
is an active process.
Yeah.
When it's in your head alone, it just stays like a kind of toxic poison that just sits in your body and your mind, and nothing shifts.
Yeah. Another question from tonight. I lost my partner to an unexpected heart attack. I know how much his mother is hurting and wants to share pain together, as we were the two closest people to him, but I don't think I can handle his mother's pain on top of my own, which feels completely debilitating. And at the same time, don't want her to feel my pain on top of hers for the same reason. How do I support her while supporting myself?
I would tell her the truth. I mean, I think what can happen is that when a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, you have different relationships with the person that died, and but it sounds like you will feel overwhelmed by his mother's loss, but also you don't want to overwhelm her, and then you're worried you need to protect each other. So, I mean, I think, can you be honest with your mother-in-law and say, you know, we both loved him so much, we both miss him so much, we both grieve him so much. Can you kind of create safe ways of doing it with her, that you and she do something together that reminds you of him, that connects you to him, that isn't about her telling you all that she feels? You know, a shared activity or a thing.
The walk seems good, because
walking and
sometimes
talking.
It takes some of the pressure off. Sometimes it gives you something else to look at,
and you're out in the spaces. I was wondering if she was very old, because I always say walk and talk, but I wonder, but that would be, or some sort of activity that you can, that isn't so intense, that somehow lifts the intensity of her telling you all that she's feeling.
And maybe finding other people, if there's anyone else who she can share her pain with, her grief with, because everybody needs to be heard. We have a question about children. So, oh, sorry, I've just lost it. I think the question was, yes, my husband died in April. I'm grieving, as well as our 4 children from 16 to 20 years in age. How can I best help my children continue to develop as rounded individuals and not tarnished by the loss of their dad at such a young age?
I don't know if the word is tarnished. I mean, they are bereaved children. They're going to feel the pain of his loss, and you can't protect them from that, unfortunately. You can't stop them suffering, and you can't, and you shouldn't stop them grieving. But by supporting them to feel what they feel and allowing them to say what they feel and be who they are, that allows them to heal and allows them to grow through it and with it. So I think often parents very understandably want to kind of make children okay so that they don't feel pain, but there isn't an alternative. Child Bereavement UK, which is the charity I'm a founder patron of, that we have masses of resources, but also groups for young people that can join and talk about the loss. And so it's good peers with young people who are grieving. They like talking to people the same age as them the best. So there's quite a lot of organizations that they could be in touch with to talk to other peers who are bereaved. There's chat lines and support lines. So if you contact CB UK, they can tell you, put you in touch with all of those. Plus we have what's called a young person's advisory group. I don't know how it's running right now during lockdown. I imagine it's all on Zoom. But I would do that if I was you, and get support for yourself.
Yeah, and I guess that's it. I suppose it's, at the moment it seems damaging, but it's thinking about how going through this process also teaches some really painful lessons. And it makes you closer to other people who have suffered. I mean, we don't like to think of it when we're in the depths of real despair, but post-traumatic growth is real. And lots of us suffer. And once you've suffered, you can, commune with other people and be kind and empathetic with them. And you can recognize that life is fleeting and that we have to do things that are meaningful to us and that we care about.
That's definitely true. And also ask your children what they need, what they want, what's hurting. Let them talk about it together in subsets as well as together. Often with families, I suggest they have like a shoebox that they cut out a hole and they pop in the shoebox memories of their dad or their mum, in this case, their dad. And every now and again, every month or so, you sit around the kind of kitchen table and you read out the memories. So people who've, in the old days when people went into your house, but each other, it's a very informal but very touching way of staying connected to their dad. It's a lovely thing.
That is lovely. We have 2 minutes. I have a quick one for you. Why is it that one feels guilty about laughing or enjoying something after your partner has died? It just seems wrong without him.
That's all of them are incredibly good questions. I think you feel guilty because you feel that your relationship with him, you need to show and demonstrate to him how much you're suffering and how much you miss him, and that somehow you're betraying him and the level of the loss that you're feeling if you allow yourself to have a moment of joy and laughter. And the important thing is to definitely allow both, that one doesn't knock the other out. So if you're laughing doesn't mean that you don't suffer pain. Like when you're suffering pain doesn't mean that you don't find something funny. So allow all the different aspects of your humanity and your emotions and your responses to live, and don't curtail them with some kind of judgment on yourself that you're only allowed to suffer.
Yeah. People have mentioned the wonderful Gary and his doodle
Gary's
tonight. And a lot of his drawings talk about how in moments of happiness and joy, he remembers Joy, his wife who died. So there can be a way that those happy moments can bring the presence of the person you love as well. So I see that we are now on the hour.
We're on the hour.
And but this has been such a wonderful discussion, and I've really enjoyed all the chat happening beneath us.
All of you that are listening and watching, please take care. And I haven't been able to read what you've been saying to each other, but I can tell that it's incredibly supportive. So what a lovely community. And join us on the 23rd for the Day of Reflection. Join us on the Grief Festival. You can follow me on Instagram. They can follow you, Liesl.
I'm on Twitter, yes.
You're on Twitter.
Yeah.
So stay in touch with us with any luck. We're not going anywhere. And use us. And that would be a lovely thing.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Julia. And see you next time. Bye for now.
Thank you, Liesl. That was lovely.